Welcome, class. So today we are looking at critical thinking, lecture 2, fallacies. So now that we've learned about reasons and claims and toolmen, now what we're going to do is we're going to explore how reasoning can go awry and how we can deal with situations where we see these things coming up. Now, a fallacy claim is basically a generic mistake in reasoning. So when somebody is making an argument to us, what we see is some kind of error or mistake that is going to raise a red flag for us. Now, there are two views of what fallacies are or how they should be treated. So we have two views here, and one view of fallacies is as incorrect logic. Okay? So when we say incorrect logic, what we're saying is that a fallacy is like breaking a rule or a law, okay? Like a law of thinking or of mathematics, if you will. And so when somebody commits a fallacy, we have to call it out, and you basically have to take back your argument, okay? So it's like the NFL, you commit a penalty, go back 15 yards, okay? So when you commit a fallacy, you broke a law, take your argument back, 15-yard penalty, result in a first down, whatever. So usually when you look at a fallacy this way, the answer is to just all out reject the argument, okay? So people who look at fallacies in this context then will just say reject the argument face on, just because of the poor reasoning that's being used. But there's another view of how fallacies should be treated, and what we'll call it is as sophistry. And so sophistry is something that comes back to the early Greek times when Greece was, the major empire. And, the sophists were people who basically gave people a hard time. So I guess in a way they were kind of like, early century trolls, if you will, but they did it face to face, obviously, and not on Facebook and Twitter and all that. And so they were very good at persuading people, okay? So the idea of treating fallacies as sophistry then is to treat it as the use of persuasive techniques that trick people into believing something, okay? So what we think of fallacies then, in this case, is not necessarily as breaking a law, but it's essentially a persuasive trick or a sleight of hand or some kind of pulling a rabbit, out of the hat, if you will, and it's trying to trick you into believing something. So the response would be then is not necessarily rejection, but what it would be is suspicion. And the argument would go something like this. You can have fallacious reasoning and still be right. So I could say, for example, I could say that I believe Chris will do well on the math test because he's Asian. Now, that's a stereotype, of course, and stereotypes often rest on fallacious reasoning. Now, here's the thing. Chris could be Asian, so that's true. And Chris could end up doing well on the math test, so that's true. So technically, I'm right? Chris did well on the math test, see? And it must be because he's Asian. But we see that that's based on fallacious reasoning. So you could have fallacious reasoning and still be right about something. So the argument for sophistry then is we can't necessarily reject the argument as a whole because you could still be right, but we just have to be suspicious. So if we were to take my argument that Chris will do well in the math test because he's Asian, that wouldn't be a good enough alone reason to accept your claim that he will do well in the math test. But if I had another reason, so let's say you called me out and you said, but that doesn't mean he's going to do well in the test, his race. I might say, but he actually has been studying for like a long time on this and he's a really good studier. Oh, okay. So the real reason Chris is going to do well in the math test is because he studied, not necessarily because he was Asian per se, right? So that's a more legitimate reason, because then the warrant is studying prepares you for a test, and so therefore, it's a little bit better of an argument, okay? So there's two different views on this, and it just kind of, there's deeper reasons as to why people will disagree on this, but either way, I think it's okay to perhaps go back and forth between the two depending on the circumstances. Okay? A lot of times the truth is in black and white, a lot of times it's in the middle, sometimes it's in this case this, sometimes it's in this case that. So just use the context and we'll avoid a long epistemology section of this 5-week course. Okay. Okay, so there are two divisions of fallacies, or there's like two groups that we can divide fallacies into, and fallacies can often fall in both, but I think it's still a useful division because of the context. So you have fallacies in making a case for a claim. So these are fallacies that when you're trying to argue for something, to make a case for something, these are common fallacies that you'll see. The other context or group in which you might see fallacies are ones that are used often in a defense of a claim. So these are a different set of fallacies that people use when their argument gets questioned and they feel like they have to respond in some way. And the reason we're looking at these in critical thinking, of course, is so we can learn to watch out for these things as we consume media and engage in public discourse. Now, the first group, fallacies that occur in making a case for a claim, there's subgroups under that we can then divide even more fallacies into. So the first ones are what we call the fallacies of relevance. Fallacies of relevance. Okay, so there's 5 that I want to go through. So first you have appeal to ignorance. And appeal to ignorance is basically arguing that because a claim has not been demonstrated to be false, then the claims can still be true. Or because a claim has not been demonstrated to be true, it must be false. So there's a lot of examples where we see something like this. So a simple one that we can all relate to. Let's say I'm flipping a coin. So the next coin flip will come up heads because it hasn't been proven that it will come up tails. Okay? So we can see the problem there. Probably more deeply if you look at like the evolution debate, right? And where life came from. So both sides of that can end up committing this fallacy. So those in favor of some kind of creator will say, well, you haven't disproven that there is a creator, so the creator can still exist. On the other hand, the ones like the atheists or whoever, they can say, well, you haven't proven that there is a creator, so therefore a creator does not exist, right? Both are technically committing the same fallacy, which is that because it hasn't been proven, it must not be true, or because it has yet to be proven, it's going to be false. You see? So either way, lack of evidence. There's a lack of evidence, so therefore I'm okay in saying this because there's a lack of evidence. That's the idea. Okay? So that's appeal to ignorance. Appeal to authority is where you appeal to your power or your prestige to say why you're right. So you see this often probably in the workplace. You might be working for some manager and your manager has a way of doing things. And you might say, you might think to yourself, there could be a totally better way of doing this. All you have to do is just make this change, make that change. Try going to your manager and they'll probably get defensive, right? And then they'll say, I'm the manager, this is how we're doing it, okay? I'm the manager, I am right. So that's appeal to authority, okay? And so basically you're saying, because I'm in a position of power, I am right. Or because I have degrees, I am right. And so that's where things can get a little stuffy because people in positions of authority can make mistakes. All right? And so that's the whole idea of appealing to authority. Well, everyone makes mistakes. So say to your manager, are you infallible? Okay, and then that's how you get fired. All right. Appeal to general belief. Okay, so you can just put appeal to general belief. And if you want, you could call it, let's see here if I can make this bigger. Okay, fine. You can call it the ad populum. That's the Latin version of it. And so this is assuming something is correct because people generally believe it. So like most people believe in abortion, so it must be moral. Okay, so that's where you're just appealing to popularity essentially and trying to say, well, because most people do it or most people believe it, it must be right. Obviously, the majority of people can be wrong still. So, people can be massively ignorant of something or massively confused or just massively uninformed. All right. And I'm sure those of you with strong political beliefs would probably maybe argue this. So, appeal to general belief doesn't necessarily work in most cases. Now, if you're going to make a claim about general belief, like polls show that people believe this, that's okay. That's not a problem. But it's when you say most people believe this, so this must be true then, people can still make mistakes. That's the idea. Then you have appeal to attitudes. It's kind of like appeal to general belief, just a little bit different. Here, what you're doing is you're saying something is right or true because it hits some kind of public attitude or emotion, okay? So you're saying, oh, now I was able to zoom out. You're saying like, you should support the war in Iraq because it's patriotic, okay? So it might be patriotic, but you might argue, but I still don't think the war is justified, right? So that's an appeal to attitudes. Or emotions. It's just saying that something is true because it feels right or because it's the patriotic thing or the cool thing or the hip thing or whatever group that you're part of that you're trying to appeal to. The last is the gambler's fallacy. And this one gets a little bit tricky, especially when we get into statistics. The gambler's fallacy is basically this, okay? So suppose there's a gambler that's been gambling for 2 hours and he keeps losing, all right? And so, he's like, okay, I've been doing this for 2 hours. I've been playing blackjack. I am due for a blackjack here. So I'm going to keep playing. And then on this next one, because I've had nothing but losses, I am bound to get a blackjack. It's statistics, right? So that's where the fallacy lands, okay? If I were to flip a coin, right? And let's say I got heads, and I pick it up and I flip it again. Each coin flip is technically independent of the other. So yes, law of averages says that eventually I should get tails, right? So if I keep getting heads, I should get tails. Law of averages says that I should, hit a mean at some point. But there's no guarantee based on the law of averages that this next time I'm going to get tails. So if I'm like, okay, I'm going to flip a coin for a third time, I've had heads 2 times, I got to be due for a tails now. There's no guarantee there that that's going to happen because remember, the coin flips are independent of each other. The 2 prior results have no influence on the third result. Even though if I did this 100 times, I would probably get tails, but I don't know when, right? Because it has nothing to do with the previous coin flips. Does that make sense? Now, the place where you see this even more is where you hear things like Atlanta is due for a hurricane. It hasn't had one in 50 years, and at the rate it's been occurring, there usually is one every 50 years. So what's going on? Or Florida is due for a flood, like that kind of thing. Or we're due for an asteroid. My science teacher in 8th grade was like, we're due for an asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, it's only a matter of time now. So all of these are essentially the kind of like the gambler's fallacy, right? Because they're saying that, we've been playing the lottery and at some point we should lose, right? Or we should win. I mean, however you want to look at it. But gambler's fallacy says every instance is technically independent of each other and they don't influence each other. Okay, so Those are 5 right there. So those are fallacies of relevance. Now, the next group of fallacies that we have, and we're still talking about fallacies that are used for making a claim, making a case. The next ones that we have are what we call fallacies of inadequate evidence. And then fallacies of inadequate evidence. Okay. I'm trying to make this bigger again. Okay, fine. So I'll just put that there. All right, cool. So fallacies of inadequate evidence. So these are when you provide premises that present relevant but not adequate evidence. So here, your evidence is relevant, but it's just not adequate. In the previous group, you had premises that weren't relevant at all. So when you're appealing to authority, when you're appealing to ignorance, when you're appealing to popular attitudes, these are basically just all little smoke screens, right, to somehow to make your conclusion true. But it doesn't really matter what somebody's position of authority is. It doesn't really matter what the press believes or the public believes. It doesn't really matter what we already know. So that is all fallacies of relevance. Now we're dealing with fallacies of inadequate evidence, where these evidence is relevant, but it's not adequate on its own. Okay, so the first one is what we call the post hoc fallacy. And the post hoc fallacy is basically concluding that because one event occurred before another, the first was the cause of the second, okay? So this has to do with the first equals the second, or the first causes the second. Now, there are times when this is actually not fallacious. Those times are when there is actually a causal explanation or a causal law that connects them. Now, this gets really deep into like the philosophy of science, because that's the whole idea. The reason we know event A influences event B is because we have some kind of larger law or mechanism that says A generally influences B. And so that's when we can still make causal claims. The problem is that sometimes people make inferences just because one thing happened for the other, but they don't really have a causal explanation for it. And so for all we know then, it could just be a coincidence, or it could be a cause of a third thing. So like an example would be like, I got sick after I got the flu vaccine. So I got my flu vaccine, then I went home, and then I felt sick. So the flu vaccine must have caused my sickness, okay? So if that's all you know, if that's your only evidence, is that I got the flu vaccine and I got sick, so the flu vaccine caused it, that would be fallacious thinking, because you have to have some kind of causal mechanism that says this thing in the flu vaccine is known to cause people to feel sick, and so that's what caused me to get sick. So what's missing in that argument is the causal mechanism. So if your only reason is that one happened before the other, that's not enough. So at that point, you have to be suspicious of the argument. But if there is more that can explain a causal link between the two, and it's sound, and it's supported by evidence and science and all that stuff, then you have a causal claim. The next one is the hasty generalization. So this is generalizing based on an adequate set of cases, and this is in your book. So basically, I've met two Hispanic people, and they both speak Spanish. So all Hispanic people must speak Spanish, okay? So that's nice that you met two Hispanic people and they both spoke Spanish, but that's a very small sample, right? Because, there's a lot of Hispanic people who actually don't know Spanish because they grew up in America for, second generation, and, Spanish wasn't used as much anymore in the household. So hasty generalization is where you're just basing a whole generalization of a group of things just based on one or two instances. Now, when we get into statistics, statistics actually has a way to deal with this problem, okay? Because as you probably know from statistics, when they do polls of like, say, the political polls, they only sample like 1,000 people. So you might be thinking, how can they generalize 267 million people in the United States based off 1,000 people? Well, what they do in statistics, and you'll learn this, is they do something called random sampling. And random sampling is kind of a way to make sure that you get a representative sample that can speak for the population, okay? And so we'll talk more about that when we get to statistical evidence. The problem with statistical evidence, though, sometimes is it's not a random sample, and you get a biased sample. So then you do have this problem of a hasty generalization, essentially, even though that's not the problem they would call it, okay? So keep thinking on that. All right, the third group of fallacies. So we're still on fallacies of making fallacies used to make a claim. Now we have fallacies of illegitimate assumption. So illegit assumption. Okay. So these are fallacies where somebody has made a questionable assumption. And so we either have to be suspicious of the argument or we have to just throw it out all in general. The first one is we have the false dilemma. And the false dilemma is basically making us force between only two alternatives when in fact there are several different alternatives. So a good one would be you must either marry or remain single for the rest of your life. Okay, well, there's middle options, right? If those were the only two, that would be depressing. But in this world, there's middle options. Well, I could maybe be in a long-term relationship and not get married, but still not be single. Or I could just have a bunch of really good short-term relationships. So it's a false dilemma if you put it like that. And it's also like the false ultimatum. I mean, there's different terms for it, but it's all the same idea. Reducing somebody's choices to a false choice. The next one is called a loaded question. So in the false dilemma, the assumption is there's only two choices. In a loaded question, the assumption is embedded in the question. So a loaded question is attempting to get an answer to a question that assumes the truth of an unproved assumption. So basically, a loaded question is a question that assumes a conclusion. The classic, everybody uses this example. When have you stopped beating your wife? So if you don't know me and if I have no known history of beating my wife and I just went up to somebody and said, when have you stopped beating your wife? The assumption in the question is that I've been beating my wife. But if I haven't been, then that assumption would be called out. But you can see how that loaded question can embed that assumption, and then it forces me to stop and think, wait, I don't beat my wife. What's that all about? Because if I answer yes or no, then I'm assuming the truth of the question, right? If I say, when have you stopped beating your wife? Oh, I haven't. I haven't lately. The assumption is that I have, you see? So loaded question then is one that has a conclusion embedded into it. The next one is begging the question. And begging the question is when the reason for the conclusion is not really different from the conclusion or claim itself. So in other words, you're supporting the conclusion by using your conclusion as the reason. So if somebody were to call James a murderer, okay, and I wanted to know who did he kill or whatever. So if I've said, why is James a murderer? And you said, James is a murderer because he wrongfully killed somebody. Well, technically, that's begging the question, right? Because usually you call somebody a murderer when there's evidence to believe that somebody killed somebody. But if you answer the question by just giving me a definition of what a murderer is, you're just begging the question. So a better response would be James is a murderer because on December 25th, 2014, he came into somebody's house and he killed his brother. And here's the evidence, that kind of thing. Okay? So that's begging the question. Lastly, slippery slope. And this one's a big one. See this all over the place. Slippery slope is when you assume that because there's no significant or little difference between 2 points on a continuum, then there's no important difference between even widely separated points on a continuum. So basically it's this. Because there's no difference in the little cases, there's really no continuum at all. Okay, so here's an example of the slippery slope. So here's a number line, all right? And let's say the speed limit right now is 50. And what citizens want is they want to raise the speed limit to 55. Now let's say there's somebody in there who just doesn't like people driving fast. So this is what they argue. They're like, well, if we raise the speed limit to 55, what's to stop us to making the speed limit 80? Because see, we're just going to go to 55, and then we're going to go to 70, and then we're going to go to 80, and then we're going to go to 90, and then we're going to go to 120. Okay? So you kind of see the argument. And we've seen this, you see this all over the place, okay? And so what they essentially do is they say, well, if we give you a little bit, you're going to take a mile. So if we allow the 55, next thing you know, we're going to be at 120, okay? So the slippery slope is basically this, that there's no difference between this, moving to this, and moving to that, all right? But we know that there's a problem here, right, in this thinking, which is that we usually have things called thresholds, right? So a threshold is like, okay, we're just going to 55. People know that, like, when you're going 80, that's really fast. I mean, that's above highway standard, right? So we kind of have a threshold around here. And I don't even think anybody's car can really get to that, okay? So the idea is that just because we move here doesn't mean that we're going to suddenly end up here, because we have thresholds that basically tell us that, like, look, if we're starting to get really fast, like 80, people will probably throw up, or people's cars can't handle going to 90 or whatever. Common occurrences of this is kind of like, if we allow, if we allow assisted suicide, if we let people kill themselves, then what's to stop letting doctors killing people? And then next thing you know, what's to stop us from having death panels and insurance? So once again, it's thresholds, right? Like, there's a difference between killing yourself and like having doctors killing you. Okay, we have thresholds here that prevent those things from happening. Pretty much every policy issue has some kind of slippery slope that people throw out there. With the gun control debate. Well, if we require, gun locks, what's to stop us from also requiring a registry of databases of all the gun owners? And then what's to stop us from having lockers that we have to put our guns in? Well, obviously thresholds, right? Like, we know that passing a lock is different than having a database. There's different laws regulating each and all that stuff. But you can kind of see how the slippery slope then gets used to try to say, nope, if we go to 55, that's just opening the door to going to 90, 120. You see what I mean? So the key then to respond to the slippery slope when somebody does that is we have thresholds, right? And there's differences and different points where we start to have realizations like, we can't go that far because there's these mechanisms in place. Okay. Now, so that was one set of fallacies, remember? So those were fallacies for making a claim. Now we're looking at a whole new set of fallacies. And these are fallacies of defense, or of criticism and response. So remember, there's fallacies for when you're making a claim, and then there's fallacies for when you're defending a claim. So there's a couple here that we want to look at. First, you have the ad hominem attack, and this is in your book. So this is when you reject a claim or an argument by offering as grounds personal characteristics of the person supporting it. So in other words, we should reject this argument because this person made it. Example, and it just depends on, I don't know who your political commentators are, but like Rush Limbaugh if you're conservative or Rachel Maddow if you're liberal. But you might say, Rush Limbaugh is a bleeding heart conservative, so he's wrong. So Rush Limbaugh says something, and you're like, well, it's Rush Limbaugh, so he's wrong. Okay? Technically, no matter if Rush Limbaugh is conservative, liberal, libertarian, Rush Limbaugh can still say true things, okay? Or Rachel Maddow, or Hillary Clinton, or Donald Trump, whoever you want to pick, okay? All of them can still say true things, regardless of if they're liars, maybe if they're liars, even then they can still say true things. But even if they're conservative, New York, it doesn't matter. So Rush Limbaugh could say Barack Obama is the president, and you wouldn't say, well, Rush Limbaugh is conservative, so he must be wrong. Well, no, he can still say true things. So it technically doesn't matter the person's personal characteristics then. What matters is the reasoning in the argument, right? So if Rush Limbaugh said the economy is going down because, the Washington Post reported a decrease in GDP, well, then, that he could be right. I mean, he could be right on that point. If Rachel Maddow said that the economy is going down and you wonder why, and she's like, well, because I read this in this newspaper, and you're like, well, that newspaper is liberal, so she must have gotten her argument from a biased source, then you can attack the argument, but not because Rachel Maddow's liberal, but because Rachel Maddow drew from a biased source. So what you're really attacking is her methods. Does that make sense? You're not really attacking Rachel Maddow, you're attacking Rachel Maddow's methods. And that's a more objective debate than, but too bad you are a liberal, that kind of thing. Now, there are times, though, when a person's characteristics might matter. And these are specific times when we are accepting a claim just on the word of the person making it. The most common example is personal testimony, okay? So for example, let's say I had a neighbor, and his name was Chris, and Chris said, I had an encounter with aliens, all right? Now, if it's well known that Chris is a chronic liar, if it's well known that Chris maybe is a joker and likes to play jokes on people, or maybe Chris has some kind of, dementia or mental illness that causes him to hallucinate, then it's okay. Those ad hominem attacks would technically be okay because the basis for believing his claim is his character, right? Because if he was the only one that was there who saw the alien, then we have to go on Chris's word alone. So in that case, Chris being a liar, Chris being a practical joker, Chris being mentally ill, that does become relevant because it's based on his word. But if Chris said that Barack Obama is the president of the United States, it doesn't matter that he's a liar, practical joker, or, demented or whatever, because it's not based on his word alone. It's something that we can verify ourselves. Does that make sense? So there, ad hominem becomes important. So that's why in trials, for example, lawyers will attack the credibility of the witness because we're basing what the claims that the witnesses are making are based on their word alone. So what we try to do, or lawyers try to do, is discredit the witness to say that basically we can't take you at your word. Okay, so long thing on ad hominem attacks, but important. Okay, then you have the U2 fallacy, and it's not the band, but like U2? Okay. Or et tu, brute, if you're all Shakespearean, there's people use different things for it. The et tu quoque. But basically, it's arguing that because the other side does it, it's okay for you to do it. So, this is where you get into debates about hypocrisy, right? So we might say ISIS kills innocent civilians, but then ISIS might come back and say, but the US does too. So what ISIS is basically saying, well, you kill civilians, so I can kill civilians. But the problem with the argument is that, or the problem with this fallacy or making that claim, is just that even if I'm a hypocrite, it doesn't necessarily change the fact that you're doing something wrong. And what's also important is that we can still take a stand against a moral wrong and still say, look, it is wrong, and we're doing something about it, or it's wrong, and so we need to stop now because it's bad for both of us, right? So just because you're guilty of doing something yourself doesn't mean that you can't take a stand against it to say that it's wrong and, and deal with it that way. The very classic fallacy that you've been shown, too, was probably by your mom, right? So, you go to your mom and you're like, Mom, can I go to Worlds of Fun with my friends? And your mom's like, no, you're not allowed to go to Worlds of Fun by yourself. But Chris is going, Well, if Chris jumped off a bridge, would you jump with him? That's basically the two-quote fallacy. Okay, this fallacy basically. Okay. The next is we kind of have the poo-poo. I've heard it also called the horse laugh. Basically, this is where you just dismiss an argument without considering it. So let's just say like you're claiming that, Obamacare is destroying America, and somebody's like, but Obamacare has helped people. And you're like, well, that's just liberal nonsense. Okay, so that's not really addressing the argument, that's just dismissing it. Like you're just labeling the argument as nonsense or mumbo jumbo or whatever. You're giving it some kind of label, but you don't really ever deal with the argument. Or if the United States, so like this is one that I've seen. So like on 60 Minutes when the NSA people were on there and they were like, we need to have some kind of wiretapping because this is how we do national security. People in the comments were like, see, this is United States propaganda, government propaganda stuff, and so that's basically horse laugh. So no matter what the government says to defend its wiretapping, if you're just going to call it propaganda, there's no room for debate because no matter what they say, it's propaganda. Okay? So that's the poo-poo horse laugh fallacy. It's not really addressing the argument, it's just labeling it as something and then just dismissing it as that. Propaganda, poo-poo, whatever. All right, then you have the straw man fallacy. And this is where you're misrepresenting an opponent's claim to make it easier to criticize their claim or to make it implausible so that it doesn't even need to be criticized. The very classic example of the straw man fallacy is like the evolution debate, if there is one. The theory of human evolution just boils down to the idea that humans evolved from monkeys, okay? So that's the straw man fallacy, because basically it's misrepresenting what the theory of evolution says and making it sound ridiculous, when in fact, the theory of evolution actually argues that we didn't evolve from monkeys or apes, but we had a common ancestor that led to the development of monkeys, apes, and so forth, and humans, okay? But when people say, like there's that song, I don't remember, but it's like a church hymn, and it's like, I don't believe I evolved from a monkey, God created me, something like that. That's technically not right. That's not the argument for evolution. So, that's the straw man. Loaded words is where, I forgot to write the word. This is using unnecessary or packed words to make something support a conclusion. So loaded words is basically where you're using judgmental, negative, and just overall labeling words that just make it clear what the conclusion is to support your conclusion. So like an example might be like, medical research on animals must be stopped. The torture of innocent creatures is morally indecent, and those evil scientists are creating crimes and atrocities across the world. So basically you're just like laying it out there with all these like derogatory and pejorative words that essentially just kind of support your conclusion and try to get us to think of scientists as basically evil human atrocity creators. Okay? So loaded words, you got to watch out for them. And lastly, last group, fallacies of defense. So remember, we're still talking about fallacies that people use to defend their arguments. Why do you keep putting FAC? I don't know what's going on. Okay, fallacies of defense. Last two. So the first one we have definitional dodge. The definitional dodge is where you're redefining a crucial term to avoid acknowledging a counterexample that would falsify the claim. So like, I was trying to find a good example of this. So like, there are theories of human behavior that operate on this idea called the minimax theory. So like minimax, or like the minimax principle, if you will. So I'll write this down. You don't have to know it for the test or anything, but this is to show you. So the minimax principle basically says, it's like a theory, it's a rational choice theory. And basically, it says that people will minimize their costs and maximize their rewards. And this comes with anything. Like with relationships, people try to find relationships that minimize their costs, maximize their rewards, and so forth. People will only do things that minimize their costs and maximize their awards, and so forth. And so they'll try to say everybody operates on this theory of rationality. Everyone makes choices that they think will serve their interests and cause them the least amount of pain. But then when you try to provide examples, well, what about people who do altruistic acts? What about people, really brave men and women who go to Iraq and Afghanistan, and go fight and then dive on the grenade when it gets thrown? Like, how is that serving their selfish interests, if you will? And so that's when this is where you see the definitional dodge. Oh, but they're not really being rational. Like, that's not really rational behavior. You see what I mean? So they're not really acting, okay? And so it doesn't really apply to them. Or they're just, you change the definition of what rational is to make it unfalsifiable. So the other direction they'll go is they'll say, well, actually they are being selfish because when they dive on the grenade, they're just thinking about how bad they would feel if their comrades died. So either way, they're just redefining it to make it so it's unfalsifiable. So the whole idea of a definitional dodge is to make your claim unfalsifiable by constantly shifting the definition to fit whatever counterexample that fits, that applies. And then lastly, exception proves the rule. This is another move that people try to do. And they'll try to use exceptions as instances to prove the rule. So like, for example, you might have an argument like, most states that have gun laws have less violence. And then somebody might respond and say, but what about Kansas and Missouri, where they have more violence despite all their gun laws? The person might come back and say, well, see, 20 out of 30 states have less violence, you see? So they'll just kind of say, well, yeah, there's the exception. See, but that proves me right. See, the exceptions prove the rule. But if Kansas and Missouri are good counterexamples to that claim, then it doesn't prove the rule. But people will try to sneak around it and say, see, but I'm right. So those are fallacies of defense. So overall, you have a lot of fallacies here. I mean, I think I went over like at least 20, I think, or something. Let me see. I got 5, and then 7, and then 11, 16, 18. So I was close. So 18 fallacies to look at. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So good luck on your quiz and with your critical thinking exercises and application to everyday life.